Welcome back. I'm talking about contemporary literature today. Remember, the last lecture was post 1945 literature, and I could have probably just left it at that, but I feel like I want to also give a little bit of extra attention to about the decade of the 80s up until the present, because I'm not really satisfied with that large bucket that they throw everything into and call it post 1945 literature. We don't yet have the retrospect and the distance in time to be able to really talk about what kind of movements are happening today. All we can do is make observations and try to figure out in real time kind of like what we're doing and what the features of these types of literature are. But we can't do a thorough overview and analysis of it the way we can with, modernism or romanticism or all of these other movements. Even within those other large movements, they're not homogenous. There are all kinds of different things going on in them, and we just have to take account of all of these weird differences and variations within it. But it's easier to do with retrospect. So I want to talk about all the different variations of things that are happening and try to make some sense out of it and try to kind of predict what it might be thought about like in the future. Um, so post 1945 literature is sort of this just broad term that in the world of literature we have decided to call everything that's happened since World War II. It really there's enough clarity that like we can use 1945 as the beginning of like something new that was happening. I think 20 years ago people would have pretty comfortably said after 1945, after the end of modernism, then we went into postmodernism. But I think some things have happened since then where we're not completely comfortable just calling it postmodernism. I personally think, as I said in the last lecture, that postmodernism is my favorite overarching term to use all this stuff or to sort of label all this stuff as. And I would like to just like look at the intricacies within it. However, there are good reasons to sort of challenge that. I think some of the reasons are that, especially starting like maybe around the 1980s and then gaining momentum after that, there was a big push to challenge the literary canon. And what I mean by that is that there are a lot of works that are sort of semi-permanently put into this category of important works to read throughout history. But that has always been kind of heavily influenced by people who were in control of the literary world. And although there were a lot of women writers and a lot of writers of color, and a lot of writers from all over the world, the power was sort of this colonial kind of center of power where there were a lot of just old white guys who controlled what they thought was the most important stuff. So now we're looking back at all of that, and we've been doing that throughout this course, looking at the canon and trying to figure out, well, how can it be challenged? What's important about the canon, and also what can we do to think differently about it as we're looking back in time at it? Since about the 1980s, we've been doing that in real time. So things have been kind of like really mixed up. Postmodernism, I think, is sometimes seen as a genre that happens to have a lot of white men writing in it. So that is sort of an indication that maybe we should be thinking twice about it. So right now, we're just talking post 1945 literature, and we're going to be sorting it out as we go as scholars. That's part of our job. I want to particularly focus on the 80s and on because I kind of stopped at about the decade of the 80s in my last lecture intentionally so that I could talk about how I think things have been a little bit different from that point on. So I think that there are some things that have happened culturally that have been making literature quite a bit different from the 80s on, and then maybe some finer point things in this century, I guess. Um, in the last lecture, I said that the postmodernism would be sort of this. The word post is a look back. A word post doesn't just mean after. The word post means like a second look at something, right? In like say the 90s or so, we started talking about what some people were calling the postmodernist movement, which I kind of think is really lazy. But there are some good reasons why people were using that terminology, because if postmodernism is taking a second and closer look at modernism, then postmodernism was taking a second and closer look at postmodernism. That says something about the way we think about things, especially toward the end of the 20th century and now into the 21st century, where we are really trying to slow down our thinking and just try to like look back and figure out, where are we? How did we get here? Why are we in this place? And what's going on? And we can't seem to be able to catch up in that way with this thinking. So we keep trying to take pauses and look just a little bit backwards to try to figure out what's happening. So this idea of postmodernism in some ways was that. Sometimes people call it meta-modernism or meta postmodernism, or meta-modernism, and it's so there's just a lot of terminology. Anyway, um, what we're doing since the 80s, it's still challenging genre. It's still like blending and hybridizing and altering um, these genres in new ways to create something original. But one thing it does is it starts to leave behind the kind of really cynical and detached attitude. And in favor of that, it looks toward trying to do something genuine and also showing emotional vulnerability. And I think this idea of emotional vulnerability has really carried through since like the early 90s, um, and is something that has come to some sort of crescendo right now. This idea of emotional vulnerability is everywhere right now, and I think it's being heavily criticized at the same time as it's being embraced. Um, in the 90s, there was this movement called the New Sincerity, and the main person in that movement was David Foster Wallace. His huge, to use a pretentious term, his like magnum opus was his book Infinite Jest. And he was trying to really examine how to be sincere in a way that that he kind of thought was sort of abandoned in the 50s, 60s, 70s, maybe 80s. There are other writers in this genre, so Jennifer Egan, Dave Eggers. These are all people who were trying to capture some sort of um, genuine emotion that they thought had been lacking, while still using this sort of fragmented style that bends genres, etc. Culturally, there are a lot of things like this happening in the 90s too. I mean, even think about like grunge bands. Think about Kurt Cobain and his extreme emotional vulnerability, and he actually, ended up committing suicide. Um, with a lot of speculation that this sort of thing was connected. So culturally, there were all kinds of things like that happening. Then 9/11 happened. So in 2001, after 9/11 happened, um, that of course had an effect on literature, as all cultural events do. And that's again something we're still kind of sorting out. But I think a couple of things happened after 9/11. I think we start to see more and more of a split in attitudes in people in the country, and also a split culturally, which means there are also going to be splits literarily. So this idea of sincerity and emotional vulnerability, on one hand, I think exploded even more because a lot of people were craving, they're starting to see the world as sort of a dark and scary place, and they wanted to embrace what they thought was sweet and good about the world. On the other hand, we start seeing a lot more sort of military focused and dark and violent sort of literature happening at the same time. So there's a strange dichotomy happening. And sometimes these dichotomies would merge, sometimes they would separate from each other, but they've been kind of consistently there for a long time now. Think about how bad it's gotten now with all the polarization we have politically, culturally. So some of the things that happen is we start to see um, some darker speculative fiction. We have start to see like horror and fantasy and sci-fi genres kind of blending, um, dark technological stories. So whereas in like maybe the 70s, 80s, people would have thought of the future and technology as something that was almost magical and was going to make our lives easier, we start to now see it as something that is going to be our demise, something that we're afraid of. Um, there are a lot of dystopian novels and dystopian stories. Um, On another note, that's not necessarily so dark and negative. Magical realism, like I was talking about in the last lecture, still persists. Magical realism, which started off being a form that was used in Latin America as almost a form of protest. Well, definitely as a form of protest in literature, starts spreading worldwide. We start to see a lot of magical realism, which brings interesting, fantastical wrinkles into non-fantasy stories. So this tension between sort of the dark and the violent and the pessimistic versus this kind of sensitivity and almost like a return to childhood are all sort of intermingling. And it seems strange, but I think it manifests in ways that seem understandable. So one thing that it makes me think about personally is like video games. Um, Back when I was a kid, video games were just for kids, and as I grew older, I didn't become a gamer. I'm 51 years old, so I'm not really a gamer. But anybody who's even just a little bit younger than me, it's likely that they'll be gamers. And to me, it's sort of like, these games have really dark, violent focuses, and then at the same time, they're toys, right? So we start to see this video game culture where it's kind of dark and violent, but also it's adults who are still utilizing this idea of a toy to use their imaginations. I don't mean that in an insulting way. I just think that's a cultural development that came out of this. See what else has been happening. Another thing that happens a lot post 9/11 is the rise of young adult fiction. So, I mean, whether it's Harry Potter or what are some of the other ones? Hunger Games. Some of these are dark and dystopian, and also young adult. So there's something about making things understandable and easy to read, and being able to continue to do that into adulthood too. So I think that like back in the 50s, a lot of people were reading some pretty complicated literature at home. Starting about in the 80s and then also crossing over 9/11 and all that, I think that we want a little bit more simplicity or easiness. We want the literature we read to be a little bit easier to read. And that doesn't only mean that we're all reading young adult fiction. I think there's just a minimalism that takes over even in works of literature, where even if there are complicated themes, we don't want our reading experience to be complicated. I mean, I love it when my reading experience is complicated. That's why I'm such a Faulkner fan, and Virginia Woolf and all the modernist writers. That's why I love them. But it's also, there's something to be said for being able to read leisurely and understand very easily what's going on in a book. So this minimalism, I think, still persists all the way up until today. So I have assigned 2 books for this unit that you'll be reading. You'll just be spending a week on each one. And I think that both of these books bring together multiple elements that I've been talking about and really represent a pretty, very current, contemporary kind of literature because of it. And also, I think that they also represent books that should be in a very broadly articulated class like this, where I want there to be a lot of different kinds of books from a lot of different authors with different identities from different places in the world. So the books that you'll be reading are Love Medicine by Louise Erdrich and Science Preceding the End of the World by Yuri Herrera. And I want to just talk a little bit about both of these. Remember, you're going to be reading this one this week and then this other one the next week. This one, I am going to suggest highly that you read the whole book. But as far as the purposes for like assignments go, it's going to be okay if you read 3 chapters of your choice. The reason I'm doing that is because I just want to make sure everybody can catch up and nobody's going to get behind. And I want to give you a little bit of freedom also, especially since you're looking forward to having to write a final paper soon. But reading this whole book would be the best thing, but at least read 3 chapters. The reason I feel a little bit comfortable saying that you can read a few chapters instead of all of it is that this book is sort of a series of loosely connected stories that act as chapters. So, although it's a complete novel, each one of the chapters can stand alone as its own story, which I think makes it a pretty interesting book. Um, it was published in 1984, and it features three different families. It is fiction, but it features three different families, and they all belong to the Chippewa Nation. They're all living in North Dakota, and this book kind of has everything you would expect. It has moments of strange, surreal occurrences, but it is pretty much a work of realism. It has that minimalistic style that's pretty easy to read. It has a lot of emotional sincerity in it. It even has some love stories. At one point, it has some infidelity and a love triangle. It addresses alcoholism and emotional strife and death and all of that kind of stuff. And it's multi-generational. So it follows these three families that are all connected to each other in multiple ways for several decades. It's a very, very sweet and engaging and important book, written by a Native American, about Native Americans, and written by a very important author in this field. So the author is Louise Erdrich, and she's from Little Falls, Minnesota, which is right over by like Brainerd and St. Paul. So she's a local author, but she's also a very important author who has sort of been a big deal. She's won a Pulitzer Prize, and yeah, check this book out. It's possible you've already read this book because it's a really popular, well-selling book, but I find it to be the perfect fit for this class because it gives us a different kind of take on the few pieces of American literature that I've been showing. Okay, the other book is Science Preceding the End of the World by Yuri Herrera. Yuri Herrera was born in the state of Hidalgo in Mexico, so he's a Mexican writer. Actually, right now he's a professor at Tulane University in New Orleans, so he's living on this side of the border in the United States. But this book was originally published in 2009 in Spanish, so it was written in Spanish, and it wasn't translated into English until 2015. The translator, her name is Lisa Dillman. She actually won an award for translating this book. So not only is this a really interesting and cool book, but it's the translation of it is award winning. This book follows the main character named Machina, and she is crossing the border. She's crossing the border from Mexico into the United States with a message from her boss. So this is a book about a journey. It's a book about a crossing. So there are some very, very classical themes in this book. Think largely in the grand sort of literary interpretation of what a journey means and what a crossing means when you're reading this book. It's about sort of like a world of crime, but it's also very classical in some senses. And I don't want to give too much of this away, but think about how it bends this classical genre that might talk about a crossing in a pretty classical way and brings it to a completely current and modern setting, sort of set in the crime world, and see what you can make of it. This book isn't probably going to be exactly what you expect. So just read it with an open mind and realize that there are going to be some kind of neat revelations that happen during this book. This one is only about 100 pages long. I do want you to read this entire book. You have a whole week to read just 100 pages here. And this will be worth it for you. And this will be a nice book to keep in your collection too. So first of all, you'll have a week to read at least three chapters of this one, but make sure if you can, you should just read the whole thing. And then this one, you'll have the next week, 1 week to read the entire book, the entire really short book. I think those are going to work out really well, and they're going to really round out our understanding of what this class means and what I'm trying to do with all the individual pieces of literature and authors in this class. So what about right now? This brings us up to pretty current in the literary world. This was written in 2015, this last one, but so over 10 years ago. But what's happening with literature right now? And that's something I'm really interested in that I think you should ponder too. World War II was a pretty clear cutoff. We had a lot of cultural changes worldwide in 1945 as the World War came to an end, and we're also having a technological boom, and all kinds of things like that, right? Then the world has undergone a lot of change since then too. And where, when we look back retrospectively, are we going to draw the line to say, well, that's where that movement ended, and here's where another one started? So I used to kind of think as 9/11 on 2001 being that point when eventually when we looked back, we were going to say, all right, from the end of 2000 or from the end of World War II up until when 9/11 happened, that seems like a movement in sort of an era. And then we sort of started crossing over into something else. That might end up still being the line. But now some other things have happened that make me wonder. I have to get political here because the world of literature is steeped in politics and culture. But I think Trumpism is something that is radically changing the face of the earth in a really quick way. And we have started thinking about the world in a completely different way since our political landscape, not just the United States, but around the world, has been dominated by Trump and Trumpism. So it seems logical that someday we might look back and see that that's a spot where sort of a large movement ended and a different one began. Now, I'm thinking that we're living at sort of a nexus of things right now because we also have artificial intelligence that has really come into prominence just in the past couple of years. I think that some of you agree with me and some of you might not agree with me, but my very solid explanation and my very solid opinion about this is that AI is destroying universities, it's destroying our creativity, and it's going to have a hugely negative impact on literature. So I think that the very minute AI went public in an unregulated way that we never asked for, that universities were never consulted about and weren't prepared for, that very moment has to mark some sort of change in the way the literary world is viewed. So I think someday when we look back, we're going to see this sort of like early 2020s as being some sort of cutoff. And we're going to see what happens from here on. It could be that a lot of innovative stuff happens, or it could be, unfortunately, that possibly nothing happens at all. Are human beings going to keep on writing things? Of course. But are we going to be writing things and having them published in the same way as they were before? Absolutely not. Are there going to be discernible differences between AI writing and human writing? I have no idea. There might or there might not be. One thing that is sort of scary to think about is when we're looking at all of these different movements, are we right now looking at the end of the last literary movement ever to happen? That's just something to think about.